All right, hi class. We're gonna really quickly review what we went over in the last video, starting off with parts of the instrument. We of course have our mouthpiece, ligature, and reed. We have our neck, and then there's the body of the saxophone. Body of this, oh, and the neck strap, of course, yes. Very essential. Mouthpiece cap, cork grease, etc., etc. Putting the mouthpiece and reed and ligature together. Remember, start with the ligature, make it a little bit loose, slide it up with your thumb, slide the reed in between, leave a tiny bit of black at the top of the mouthpiece. Make sure your ligature is centered, not too low, not too high. Tighten it. Paper test, remember, draw the line on the reed. We know. All right. The pitch we're shooting for on mouthpiece and neck is an F sharp or A flat. The pitch we're shooting for on just the mouthpiece by itself is an A. As far as general hand placement, that thumb on the back thumb rest. Between 1 and 2 o'clock, fingers nice and curved, pinkies relaxed, and your right hand thumb under the hook, fingers nice and curved, pinkies relaxed.
Can you talk about the left hand again, which keys to skip?
Yeah, so you're going to skip. It doesn't look like a pearl on mine, but this first spatula key will probably look like a pearl on beginner students. So you're going to skip that first key, first finger on the second. You're going to skip the small third one, middle finger on the fourth one, and then your ring finger on the last one, and then pinky just hovering on the pinky table. All right, as far as posture goes, feet flat on the floor, sitting up straight, of course. You're gonna start your students with the saxophone on the side. Once they get bigger, they can choose to put it in the middle if they want, but start them on the side. You want it halfway in between your knee and your hip. If it's at your hip, the angle is too low. If it's at your knee, the angle is too high. As far as the neck strap height, you want it so that you can bring the instrument to you comfortably. I don't have to work to bend it and maneuver it a certain way. It's just there.
What about the angle of the mouth?
As far as the angle of the mouthpiece, you want everything straight on in your
left
mouth.
or right?
Yeah, you want that mouthpiece straight on, so that what that's going to look like is it's going to be a little curved off to the side, because the instrument is going to be on your side, and so.
So remember, there's no need for a student to lean their head to the left or to the right to get to their mouthpiece. That mouthpiece rotates.
Yeah, just generally you want everything to be as easy as possible. Let the instrument come to you. You should be sitting up straight, relaxed, head up and centered and forward. All right. Oh, no, we're good. All right.
Do you want to do a little articulation?
Yeah. So the articulation syllable we're using, I really like do. Remember we had a was it lowercase d, capital EW, do. You're looking for a raised tongue, not super high, but still raised, and tip of the top of the tongue to the tip of the reed right there. If you have it too low, it'll sound really thuddy, and if you have it too high, you'll just be chipping the reed. So. That sort of sound. All right. All right. So we're going to review the sort of like oral and visual diagnostics. If you have your common problems and remedies for the saxophone, go ahead and pull that up. That's what we're going to be looking at for this portion. Symptom number 1, students just not getting a sound at all. Biggest thing, the reed's not vibrating. You need to soak the reed a little bit before you play, either in your mouth or in a cup of water. Don't go into it dry, the reed won't vibrate and you won't get a sound. Make sure your air is fast enough. Your reed might be at too soft or too hard strength. Generally, what size do you start them on?
I started on like a 2.5, and then after that first box is gone, we go right to a 3, like a
Right to
Van
3.
Doren.
Okay.
D'Addario also those reeds are kind of
Yeah.
the same strength.
Yeah, start 2.5 and then work up from there. Just make sure that their mouthpiece, they're taking enough mouthpiece. So that's what the line on the reed is for with the paper test. All right. Problem number 2, squeaking. Just like clarinet, there's a ton of potential problems. Number 1, sudden change in embouchure while we're playing. We of course want everything to be as consistent as we can. But if you do make a sudden change, it's really easy to if you change a lot of things in your mouth all at once, tone goes out the window. So just remember to relax, keep everything firm, and in the same place. Maintain a still face. Problem number 2, or potential problem number 2. Fingers are not firmly pressing the keys to close the tone holes. I don't see this problem too much on saxophone, unless there's an issue with the instrument itself, like the mechanism's not closing all the way. But generally, if you push the pearls down, it's going to close the key, and it should be fine unless there's a leak. But there's nothing you can do about that. Just make sure the fingers are pressing the keys firmly. Problem number 3, bumping the side keys. Again, this is really common with middle schoolers with small hands. A lot of student models try to have remedies for this with lower key heights, but there's only so much you can do. So again, if you bump these palm keys on accident on your left side, you're going to squeak or get a higher note. Same thing with the side keys on your right side. All we have to worry about there is just hand position. Make sure things are curved and that you're far enough away from the side keys that you're not going to bump into them. Potential problem number 3, biting, or number 4 rather, biting. What this would sound like is, this is really common with middle schoolers. It's just a really thin, pinched, high sound that's going to come out.
You guys notice that he's playing in the center, but we would always start our beginners on the side just because of their height. They're not very tall.
Mm-hmm.
As they grow, that saxophone kind of naturally moves back to the center.
Mm-hmm. And if they try to play it in the center, a lot of times they'll end up trying to rest it on the chair, which no bueno. Just keep it on the side. All right. For biting, relax your jaw. It says you can try a double lip embouchure for a while until the student stops biting. But yeah, just generally just relax things. Last problem potentially, tonguing too hard. It might not work with this reed, but
it kind of chirps at the beginning.
Yeah, that's the thing that we're looking for. Just making sure that we use the right articulation syllable, like the or t or do, and making sure we're tonguing in the right spot on the reed. Again, tip of the tongue to the tip of the reed.
So I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask you to do 3 things. So take too much mouthpiece. I want you to really loose embouchure, and I want you to overblow. Okay, so that's some of your students are going to sound like that right away. So if you hear that, then those 3 things that I just said, make sure they're not taking too much mouthpiece. Make sure that their embouchure is firm and their teeth are secure on the top of the mouthpiece. Make sure that they're not overblowing it.
Because we just move it back from just everything more controlled instantly. All right. Next symptom, if your sound is flat and squawky. So like we just talked about, too much mouthpiece. That's why we do the paper test with the line on the reed. Just make sure your mouth is joining it where the reed meets the mouthpiece. Or your embouchure could not be firm enough. Like we just said, if it's really, really loose and like a saggy jaw, your corners are loose, something else that could cause that. Firm them up, bring your jaw up a little, like if we're saying he or hew, you can't do like a o or ah syllable. He, hew, versus making sure the student is hugging the sides of the mouthpiece with the corner of the embouchure and the bottom lip is squishy firm, which is our distinction from clarinet. Too little mouthpiece could also cause squeaking. This is under here we go, sharp and thin sound. So the opposite of your flat and squawking, if you have too little mouthpiece and if your embouchure is too tight. So a lot of times you might jump the octave. They'll get higher notes than they're trying to. It'll sound really thin and pinched like you just heard. Just make sure, again, proper amount of mouthpiece and proper embouchure, corners, squishy firm, all that goodness. If you hear an sound and there's spaces in between the pitches, it means they're articulating or stopping the note with their air rather than their tongue. Like a or sometimes you'll hear like a vocalization. I have a bunch of students where they're trying to start everything from down here. The only thing that starts and stops the reed is right here, is that point of contact with the tongue. Student stopping the air with the throat instead of the tongue. Yeah, make sure you're using the correct articulation syllable, and just making sure your articulation is solid. Tip of the top of the tongue to the tip of the reed. Again, on tonguing, if you hear a thwat sound, instead of a nice clear articulation, you're tonguing too far past down the tip of the reed. This is really common too, because a lot of times the closer you get to the tip, like they might feel a little uncomfortable with the tongue. They're not used to that feeling yet.
Vibration.
Yeah. So they'll tongue really far down the reed, which one makes it a lot harder for notes to speak in general, but as opposed to all right. Intonation. Generally, like I said, you're going to tune the notes we tune to on saxophone. Our concert A is going to be our written F sharp. We'll get to that later, but F sharp, written F sharp and G is what we tune to in band a lot of times. And like what I like to do is I'll make a little mark on my neck. I'll do this on my students' necks. We'll get a general ballpark of where this instrument lies in tune. And it's going to change with the mouthpiece you use, with the neck, with all sorts of things, but it's good to get a ballpark. Sharpie it on there so they at least know this is about where I'm going to be, and we can adjust from there. So if your pitch is too low, if you play your concert A and it's tuned too low, push in. If it's too high, pull out. We want to talk about specific note intonations now, or?
We can talk about that now. So inherently out of tune notes on the instrument.
Yeah, so there's a good handful of them. The two biggest ones right now, open C sharp. This is just like our open G on clarinet or our open C sharp on flute. On saxophone, it's really, really flat, consistently flat. It's generally flat, generally really open and free blowing. There's an alternate fingering that you can use for it. It gets into some crazy octave mechanism shenanigans, which we won't talk about here. But anyway, the fingering is octave key down with your thumb and ring finger 3. And that raises the pitch just a bit and helps the timbre. It's a little hard to hear, but
remember, that's opposite of flute. Flute is sharp on the C sharp, and saxophone is flat on the C sharp.
All right. And then on the other end, if it's sharp, pull the mouthpiece out. Notes that are particularly sharp on the saxophone, middle D, it's the note, unfortunately, just a half step above that middle C sharp. Thumb, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. this note is really, really sharp a lot of times. But what we can do is if on our pinky key table over here,
Turn it, angle it sideways a
oh
little.
yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
The middle inside pinky key is our low B key. If we add that to our D fingering, that drops the pitch. The E right above that, also generally sharp.
D sharp is also.
High notes and low notes, commonly out of tune, but I've heard them go both ways. But just be prepared that your high notes and low notes probably won't be the most in tune with the rest of the horns.
I just wanted to clarify on the pulling and pushing of the mouthpiece. So he's talking about when you tune your F sharp, your A concert, not when you're trying to play D in tune or C sharp in tune. You wouldn't pull the mouthpiece for those notes because then everything else on the instrument is going to be out of tune.
Yeah.
So we adjust those inherently out of tune notes either with alternate fingerings, like he said, or even manipulating the embouchure just a little bit.
But
Tongue placement, yeah.
we try not to do that with the younger students until they have a solid enough grasp on the
Exactly.
embouchure. Otherwise, they're just going to mess everything up.
Right.
All right. And then a couple closing remarks on that. The tendency when you crescendo on saxophone is to go flat, and the tendency when you diminuendo is to go sharp. So it's just like clarinet, and it's the opposite of flute. So crescendo, flat, diminuendo, sharp. And things you can do to combat that. It says on here, use the back of the tongue to voice the pitch up and down. Again, this is generally for like not super beginners. You don't want them to really mess up what's going on the inside of the mouth before they get a grasp on it. But you can use your tongue position to manipulate your pitch. Alright, so that's the common problems and remedies. Alright, next we got alternate fingerings. Saxophone is pretty lucky. There's a lot of metal on here, and there's a ton of alternate fingerings, whereas on other instruments like, I don't know, flute or bassoon, there's a lot of instances where, yep, this one is rough and this one is rough, and you just have to do it. Saxophone, you have a few options most of the time, and you generally don't want to be picking up and putting down fingers at the same time. Here we are. Okay. I guess we'll talk about B flat first. So, just like on flute, we have a couple different B flat options. These should all be in your fingering charts. Again, make sure to be reviewing those from the get-go. The fingering that I think these days most beginners are being taught, hopefully, is side B flat, which is going to be 1, 2, and then your bottom side key over on your right hand. This is a pretty solid fingering. We'll go over the other ones really quick, but hopefully these are what most middle schoolers are being taught first. This is great for scale passages. It's great for trilling between A and B flat. The other one that's really useful.
Can I interject on that?
Yes.
A. So if you think about the A sharp is B flat, so you're fingering your A, because that's the A, and then to make it sharp, you're going to add that bottom side key. So that's your B flat.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, I'm calling it the A sharp fingering as opposed to that's a good idea. Next, the other really common one, we call it bis B flat, B-I-S. We talked about in our hand placement how we skipped this small little key right here. What we can do is we can actually cover, sort of like on double thumb on flute for that B flat, we can cover this for this second key, because we're skipping that top one, cover that one and the small one with your first finger, and that's your B flat. As opposed to just pressing the first one down, which would be B, if you cover both of them with your first finger. So that's your bis B flat. Things that this is useful for, generally what I tell my students is I tell them to use this unless it's not a good idea. This is what I tell them is the go-to. The problem is that for scale passages, it doesn't work very well because notes you want to avoid from this You want to avoid going from B flat to C like that, because you're going from covering these two with one finger to just covering the C key with your other finger. That
It's
can
that
be
contrary
problematic.
motion.
Yeah,
Just like we talked about on flute. and clarinet.
You're lifting up two keys with one finger and putting down this key with another finger at the same time. It can be problematic. The other one is going from B flat to B natural. You don't want to slide with your bis. You don't want to do that. Unfortunately, what that means is bis isn't good for going between B flat and C, or B flat and B natural. So that kind of knocks out all of your scales. So for scales, I have my students use side B flat or side A sharp, but for most everything else, I have them use bis. Again, it's just like sort of like double thumb on flute, where you can leave it down and then kind of forget about it. The last B flat fingering is very situational. We call it 1 and 1 or 1 and 4. You can use finger 1 and then your pointer finger 4.
Just like the flute. We
Yeah,
don't use
just
that
like
one.
flute. It also works with really any of these right hand keys. Usually just do finger 1 or finger 4 or finger 5. This is really only useful in a couple situations. One, trilling or going back and forth between B and B flat. Because you're only pushing one key down as opposed to two for the A sharp fingering. The other instance would be in an arpeggio, maybe, where you were already pressing that finger down and you just wanted to lift as few fingers as possible.
Like from F to B flat.
Yeah, or like, F sharp to A sharp. Common like major arpeggios like that. It might be useful for that. Really, other than that, I never use it, just because going from that to G or that to A, kind of a nightmare. Just generally a bad idea. So we tend to stay away from that fingering for the most part. Intervals. All right. We have some. Do you want to do chromatic fingerings first? Do you want to do?
Let's do chromatic fingerings, and then we can do wiggles.
Okay. So we have some extra chromatic fingerings. Again, we're really trying to avoid picking things up and putting things down at the same time, and we generally have options to get out of that in almost every situation. So the first big one between B and C. So B, just finger 1, C, just finger 2. So if you have to go back and forth between that, and believe me, that trill is very common in band music, going trilling back and forth between that, not a good idea. You just have a lot of opportunity to either press both of them down or press neither of them, unless your timing and coordination is really on point. So what we do is we have this middle side key over on the right side. It's our trill C key. So if we finger B, finger 1, and use our middle side key, it sounds a C. Things to be concerned about with this: the intonation and timbre might not be the best, but it certainly is better than trying to, because that can be pretty nightmarish.
Let me just make a comment. So on your pages 9, 10, 11, 12, you can have that's all your saxophone basics. And so that goes through all of the chromatic fingerings for you. So if you're like confused right now, or you're like it's going too fast, pause the video and go over to the basics pages and start looking at those. And that takes you chromatically through the notes, and that all the fingerings are there for you.
Mm-hmm. All right, next up, it's the same thing, but in your right hand now. So F, 1, 2, 3, 4, but then F sharp is 1, 2, 3, 5, just like on clarinet in the second register. So going back and forth between those can be problematic too. So we have a trill key right here. It's gonna be, some saxophones have 2 keys here, some only have 1.
Beginners will only have one.
Beginners will only have 1. It's going to be the one right above your pinky keys, and you play it with. Do you want?
Yeah.
You got it. Oh, perfect. There you go. Yeah. So this one only has the 1.
And we generally just call that the F sharp key.
Your trill F sharp. You're going to use your ring finger, finger 6, to play that. And then this is just like your like forked F sharp and forked B fingering on clarinet with your sliver key. Same exact thing, except in a slightly different location. But yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4 for F, and then add that F sharp key. Yeah, there you go. Another fairly common trill in band music. Yeah, we just want to avoid that motion as much as possible. All of these things, all these fingerings are really useful, also, of course, in your chromatic scale, which is all over the place in middle school and band music, and in solo music in general. Okay. I think those are mostly the chromatic fingerings. Oh, for B flat, chromatic fingering, of course, 1, 2, side, that A sharp fingering, because we have to go to B natural afterwards. So we don't want to use bis, and we don't want to use 1 and 4. So side B flat for that. We have side C, and we have our trill F sharp key, or a side F sharp key. Other than that, I think all the other fingerings in the regular range are the same for your chromatic scale. Those are the 3 big ones.
So why don't we do this? Can you go to the saxophone first notes, which is page 8, and I want you to just play each of those. You don't have to do all of the notes on every line, but at least play lines 6 and 7 for them to demonstrate the tone quality diatonically, and then it's not written on this page, but then you can go chromatically so that they can kind of see what we're talking about.
So line 6, and it's 1, 2.
Of course, you would have 2 hands on the instrument if you're playing.
And then line 7.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask him to kind of angle to the side, and we're going to play the in-between notes. So we're going to go B, B flat, A flat, G, G flat, F, E. And that way you can see these chromatic fingerings he's been talking about. So starting on B and descending. Ready? 2, set. Now he's using the side key B flat, bottom side key. Lift up the bottom side key to A. Add 3 in the top pinky in the left hand for A flat. Lift the top pinky and you have G. Now G flat with the G flat key or F sharp key. Number 5, yeah, and then F. And E. Okay, excellent. That's a great way to practice that for now, especially if you have your instrument there at home. The things I want you to think about are I want you to listen to his articulation, and I want you to match that articulation. I want you to match the quality of the sound. The tone is very calm. Embouchure is nice and firm, but that'll give you an opportunity to use some of those chromatic fingerings. Then from there, in order to go the entire range of the instrument, you can start chromatic basics 1 and then going on. We will get to the really high notes on the saxophone in a later video, but we will touch base on the low notes on this video, which I think is the next thing that we do.
Oh, did you want to do the
I think that's
like
listed.
difficult intervals?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Let's do difficult intervals. Yeah. And
So-
this is like your finger wiggles.
Yeah. Is there a specific?
So look on page 10. I'm sorry, is that 10? No. 18. I can't see. 16. Page 16, 17 is our finger wiggles. So right now we're just looking at lines 1 and 2. We'll come back to line 3 later when we do our low notes. But just talk through those fingerings.
All right, so page 16, line number 1, saxophone finger wiggles number 1. The first set, G to A to G, G 1, 2, 3, A 1, 2, so you're just lifting up finger 3. Second group, A to B, same thing, just lifting up finger 2.
These fingerings are very similar to flute fingerings, and if you're going to be playing oboe, these are going to be similar to oboe fingerings. It's also similar to clarinet fingerings if you have the clarinet register key down. So if you're trying to remember fingerings for your final exam, try to compare the three, the clarinet, flute, and saxophones.
The next one, B to C. This is a great time to use your side key C.
So that's the second middle side.
Like that.
So play it with the middle finger C just so they can hear. Here's what a beginner might do. So you hear that extra sound in between. So they sometimes have to do that fingering, so you do need to kind of teach them to do that cleanly. So here's what it should sound like. Yeah, slurred. If you have them practice it slurred, then you can tell if they're doing it correctly or not.
And the last one, C to D. And we'll talk about C sharp to D also, but C to D can be tricky. You're leaving down finger 2 and then adding everything else along with your thumb for D.
You can hear how sharp that D is. So I teach those beginners to use the B key right from the start. So that's just part of the fingering. Now, when they step up to a more professional line instrument, they won't really need to use that because it is the way it's made. It's so much closer to being in tune. May or may not need it. Let's just say.
I mean, I still use that fingering all the time on mine, depending on the situation. But yeah, it's not only intonation; it's also timbre. Like the C and C sharp and those around like in your upper stack right here, very free blowing. Not a lot of resistance. Once you hit D, again, all of a sudden the air is going from only having to travel this length to having to travel all the way down here. And so the resistance is a whole lot more. So the timbre is a lot stuffier. Just a lot of times.
Beginners try to do weird things when they go from C to D because it is more resistant. So you just have to get them to make sure on the C that they're using really good air, really fast air. So we're talking about air speed. And then moving to the D, they don't change anything with their air. And you know they're going to try to stop the air with their throat or something. So you've got to make sure you're watching them for that.
Yeah, a lot of times it's counterintuitive for them. They'll think, oh, I have to compensate for these differences by doing all these extra things with my air and my embouchure.
Throat,
yeah,
tonguing
just
or something.
keep it all the same, nice, fast air. It's a lot more connected if you use that. Line 2, going up into the sort of like the second octave now.
All of these
key.
now have the octave key down.
Yeah, so octave key is down for everything from that middle D in the middle of the treble staff all the way up, ad infinitum. Octave key is down for everything, and then octave key is off for everything below that. So D to E, thumb, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
So if I were to ask you on a test, at what point would you start using the octave key on the saxophone? You would say on the 4th line D.
Unless you were using the alternate fingering for
C sharp,
in
right.
which case, yes. But yeah, 4th line D and on up, octave key. So D to E, just lifting finger 6. E to F sharp, we're going to use regular F sharp, so just lifting finger 4, going from E to F sharp. And then F sharp to G, just lifting finger 5 to go between those.
All right, so finger wheels number 2, which is on the next page, is we're dealing now with intervals, and now we're changing keys as well. So this is where some of those alternate fingerings are going to come in handy. So if we can maybe address those real quick.
Yeah,
This
so
is
in page 17,
17,
right?
sorry.
So page 17, saxophone finger wiggles number 2. We're doing jumps in the key of A and B flat and B and C.
And if you'll notice too in your book that you're given instructions on how to teach this around the edges of the page. So these are things, these balloons in around the edges, you need to really read those so that you're understanding it, you're hearing Mr. Colbert say it, but you're also reading it so you understand it and can put that, I don't want to say the word regurgitate, but you can make sure you understand that on a test.
So on line number 1, it starts off pretty simple, A to B, nothing super challenging about that. A to C sharp. If you want to use the alternate fingering there, you can, but then you're putting things down and putting them up at the same time. Another alternative for if this is not maybe working, if you're putting down a couple of these bottom side keys that can also raise the pitch on that middle C sharp, but generally that's pretty easy finger-wise. A to D, 1, 2, and then switching to adding 4, 5, 6 and thumb, and then A to E, 1, 2, adding 4, 3, 4 and 5 and thumb. And then for the key of B flat, this is where we really start to see a lot of examples for, we can use all of our different B flat fingerings. You have all 3 B flat fingerings can be done for, or that you see in these. So the first one, line number 3, B flat to C, you're going to use side B flat because you're going B flat, C, B flat, C. And then the next one, B flat to D, use bis.
So I'm going to zoom in. I want you to notice his first finger. It's just right between the key for finger 1 and that tiny key. So he's not just pushing one of them. His finger's in between them.
Mm-hmm. It's not just on that one. It's not just on that one.
Okay, very good.
Then B flat to E flat, use bis. And your E flat fingering is just like flute, just like clarinet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This top pinky key is your E flat pinky key. I know they're sort of in different places on all of the instruments, but right here, your top pinky key on saxophone, that's your E flat key.
It's kind of like flute, I guess.
Yeah, it's like flute. And then the last one, B flat to F. I normally would use bis for this, but this is one example where you can use 1 and 4. You'll notice that the timbre of the 1 and 4 B flat is a little more dampened, a little darker. The intonation is different. So
I'm going to zoom in. And so basically that's just, for that fingering, you're moving fewer fingers. So play that one again. Now do it again with bis. Notice you're having to move the right hand on this one.
And then side, you
Yeah, if you want to add that.
which can be a little tricky doing that motion with your first finger.
Right.
Something to note, the spot on your hand that you are using to push these side keys, it's going to be different for everyone, of course, but it's generally, right, for me, it's right there on my first finger. It's just wherever it lies comfortably. For the top one, you're going to have to reach probably, but for these bottom 2, just whatever is easiest right there, wherever the finger lies. All right, do we want to do B and C, or do we still move on?
There's some, we can do that. I think the rest of them are fine. Now, if we can go to our page 18 for low notes, we need to talk about beginner students tend to do crazy things when they, like I said earlier, when you start adding keys. And when we go down into the low register, just like in the shallow mode register on clarinet, they try to loosen their embouchures or flatten their tongues, and the sound kind of does not sound very characteristic, and it affects the pitch. So we kind of take them down step at a time. So if you'll look at that page, you'll notice how we add like one note each time. So basically, I would like for Mr. Colbert to talk to you about what those low notes should sound like and what they should feel like. Right. What you should see as far as embouchure goes and what you should be listening for and watching for.
So they are just naturally going to be very resonant, very honky, for lack of a better word, without any sort of adjustment on your end. If I just keep everything the same, we'll talk about this too later. But,
and I like to say this, once you've started working on the mouthpiece and getting that concert A on the mouthpiece, their low notes are going to sound so much better, and they're not going to be honky. So before I would do this low note page, I would make sure that I'm checking their mouthpieces regularly. the pitch on their mouthpieces and that they're doing that correctly. And if they have problems with this low page, have them go back to the mouthpiece only and practice that, and then come back to the low page. But that'll be the thing that really keeps them from honking those notes out.
And we'll talk about this when we get to like register jumps and like register slurs. But if their embouchure is too firm and too tight, it's going to be really hard for them to get it out.
So he's playing the right fingerings, but his embouchure is too tight, he's bitey, and so it's just going to jump up the octave and play an ugly note.
But then if your embouchure is too loose, a lot of times they'll try to compensate for that. They'll really overextend.
And that's definitely not the sound that you want your beginners doing on their low notes. That is going to be something that's real hard to change. So to avoid that, we do the mouthpiece thing and then put it right over to the saxophone, and it'll sound like this. So the quality of the sound, just like we talked about on flute and on clarinet, every register or octave should have the same quality of sound. We don't want it to be more spread in one octave than another, or louder sounding in one octave, like lower octave on saxophone. We don't want that louder. We don't want the high octave on flute to be louder or clarinet to be louder. So we just need to make sure that those all, the students understand that we keep that same pretty quality of sound.
And the way you have on page 18, line number 1, we've used this on other instruments too, the sort of like working your way down. You start on a comfortable note, where you're like, and sort of working your
And
way
I would like
down.
for you to go ahead and show them, I'm going to just zoom in, the fingerings that you're using for low C.
Yeah, so these are all using your pinkies, both sets.
So we said the D sharp was the top key, or the E flat's the
So
top
on your,
pinky right
on
hand.
your right pinky, you have 2 keys. Your D sharp / E flat is your top one, and that's used for both octaves. And then your lower pinky key is for your low C. And that's going to be, all of these have full 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down, no octave key. Add your C key for your low C. And then
From there on out, your low C key is going to be down the entire time. So C to
Yes.
B, just show them what finger you will add. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with the C key,
C key,
then the
and
middle
then
pinky B,
middle inside B. Right, and then C sharp, same thing, but outside middle pinky key. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, low C. This C sharp one, and then for B flat, it's the bottom one right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, low C, and low B flat.
And I think it's real important to talk about that left hand pinky. For children, their pinkies are very weak, and these keys are really stiff.
Yeah, and luckily there are rollers on here, so you can slide in between them. But it takes a decent amount of pinky muscle, and even for me, if I have to do a lot of low stuff down here, it's a pinky workout for sure. And maybe they might not even be able to reach them comfortably sometimes if their hands are too small.
But as far as that low B flat key, let them use almost their entire pinky on that. So not just the tip of it, but if it'll stretch and reach, let them use let me try and zoom in on that. Try to put the entire pinky on that key. Yeah.
Like that, as opposed to just trying to clip like the corner of it or something.
Yeah.
So,
So I think that knowledge for the students to be able to do that and not just use the tip of their pinky on that will give them strength. And remember, curved pinkies are much stronger than flat pinkies. So it's just keeping them, like a lot of them, on the side of their pinky rather than on the tip. On the side of the pinky, you can keep it curved, and that's going to have more strength than working from the top of the cushion of the pinky. All right. Anything else on this low register?
Well, as far as articulating down low, I'll talk about that. We sort of talked about how we don't want the embouchure to be too tight because the low notes won't speak, and we don't want it too loose. As far as articulation, I generally tongue, and I hesitate to tell this to middle school students because they'll just take it and run with it, but I generally tongue a little bit further down the reed when I'm articulating low notes. So instead of tip of the top of the tongue to the tip of the reed, we'll move my tongue down ever so slightly just to get the response a little
And
crisper.
here's what I would say. I would let them try it the way they normally tongue
Mhm.
first, and then let that be on an individual basis.
Mhm.
Now, when they start doing fast articulation, like what we're talking about here, then definitely allow them to do that. But if you, like Mr. Colbert said, if you say something about it, you're probably going to have like an inch of tongue
Yeah.
on an inch of the reed, and that's of course not what you
It's
want.
like the reed is really not that long, and you don't want to go too far. Another thing you can do, I remember if we talked about this before, like popping the fingers. If getting low notes to speak, this is fantastic, especially if you're soft. That's one of the hardest things on saxophone. Luckily, you don't see that too often in band literature, but once they start getting their solo and ensemble
This
stuff
works
going-
on flute too.
Yeah. So what you can do if you need to start on a low note, if you're just coming in on it, I like taking one of my right hand fingers, usually finger 4 for me, and
You just have to be careful because it does get a little poppy sound.
Yeah. So all you're doing is, as you start the note, you're pushing that key down, just to sort of get things going down there, so it's not completely traveling all the way.
Would you do this for us? Would you start like on a low D and go down chromatically and just tongue 4 quarter notes on each of those notes so that we can hear the articulation?
Sure.
And then do it 1 octave higher just so that we match sound. So that is a great exercise that's not written in the book that you can get the kids just to internalize. A lot of times if you take their eyes away from the music, they're going to listen a little bit better. Get them to play it maybe in that middle octave first, and then have them repeat it in the lower octave, just so that they can match the sound of the tongue and of course the quality of sound.
I think that's it for low
think that's it.
fingerings. And then is that it for the rest of the?
I believe that's it.
set?
All right, so we will see you again on the next video. Thank you.